Our next speakers, Deborah and Ralph Blumenthal, are both established authors, but unlikely collaborators. Yet in their new picture book for young readers, their separate writing careers blended to tackle a mystery that has confounded humanity since the dawn of time. Ralph Blumenthal is a distinguished lecturer at Baruch College of the City of New York and summer journalism instructor at Phillips Exeter Academy. He was an award-winning reporter for the New York Times from 1964 until 2009. Ralph has written 7 books on organized crime and cultural history. He led the Times Metro team that won the Pulitzer Prize for breaking news coverage of the 1993 truck bombing of the World Trade Center. In 2001, Blumenthal was named a fellow of the John Simon Guggenheim Memorial Foundation to research the progressive career and penal reforms of Warden Louis E. Laws, the man who made Sing Sing Sing. The book on Warden Laws, Miracle at Sing Sing, was published by St. Martin's Press in 2004. During the coronavirus pandemic, Ralph contributed articles to the Times and other publications, worked from home on his Baruch Archives blog, An Adventure in Democracy, and given virtual talks on his new book, then, The Believer, Alien Encounters, Hard Science, and the Passion of John Mack. For more than 45 years, Blumenthal led an extensive and illustrious career at the Times as Texas correspondent and Southwest bureau chief from 2003 to 8, arts and culture news reporter from 1994 to 2003, investigative and crime reporter 1971 to 94, foreign correspondent in West Germany, South Vietnam, Cambodia from 68 to 71, and Metro and Westchester correspondent from 64 to 68. He began his journalism career as a reporter columnist for the Grand Prairie Daily News Texan in 1963. An interesting year for a newsman to be stationed in Texas. Blumenthal earned a Guggenheim Fellowship, a Columbia University Graduate School of Journalism Alumni Award, the Nyman Foundation's Worth Binghamton Prize for Distinguished Investigative Reporting on U.S. air crashes. He was named a Townsend Harris Medalist of the City of College Alumni Association and inducted into CCNY's Communication Alumni Hall of Fame in 2010. Since then, he has taught at journalism in the high school summer program at Phillips Exeter Academy in Exeter, New Hampshire, and in 2010 was named a distinguished lecturer at Baruch College, where he taught journalism and currently oversees historic collections in the Newman Library Archives. You can find his website at ralphblumenthal.com. Deborah Blumenthal is an award-winning journalist and nutritionist who now divides her time between writing children's books and adult novels. She has been a regular contributor to the New York Times as well, including 4 years as the Sunday New York Times Magazine beauty columnist and a home design columnist for Long Island Newsday. Her health, fitness, beauty, travel, and feature stories have appeared widely in many other newspapers and national magazines, including the New York Daily News, the Washington Post, the Los Angeles Times, Bazaar, Cosmopolitan, Women's Day, Family Circle, Self, and Vogue. Blumenthal lives in New York City and can be reached on her website, deborahblumenthal.com. I know it's kind of a thin resume, but let's give him a big warm welcome anyway. I couldn't help it. Great, thank you.
Thank you, Peter, and thank you for your tireless efforts to put this group together. And I have to tell you that Peter returns emails. So for that alone, I think he deserves a Congressional Medal of Honor. He gets back to you immediately. So this morning, this is going to be a talk back and forth, a little bit of how I got that story. Never in my wildest dreams would I have imagined that I would be in front of an audience talking about a UFO book. I have never seen a UFO. My children have never seen a UFO. No one in my family has seen a UFO. My husband has not seen a UFO. And it's just a field that I really never looked closely at. And in fact, it's rather intimidating to be up here in front of an audience of people who I think probably half of you have tremendous expertise in this field. But a field I do know a little bit about is children's book writing. I've been doing it since 1996. And it started with a terrible, terrible tantrum that our older daughter had after a play date. She absolutely fell apart. It was 11:30, she was tired, she was hungry, and I took her home from a play date under my arm, screaming, and that really launched my career in children's book writing. I put her in a crib and immediately sat down at my correcting Selectric typewriter, which we used in those days, and wrote a children's book about my experience. So that launched my career in children's book writing. And since then, I've been concentrating on picture books of people who are passionate about their work, including Bill Cunningham, the iconic New York Times fashion photographer, Diana Vreeland, the fashion icon who is editor-in-chief of Vogue magazine and head of the Costume Institute at the Metropolitan Museum of Art, Frank Gehry, the architect, Ann Cole, the first black couture designer, who name you probably don't know because of the color of her skin, but she was the woman who designed Jacqueline Kennedy's wedding gown, the most photographed wedding gown in American history. And lastly, I did a book on Iris Apfel, who is 102 in August, who is a fashion icon who you may have seen pictures of, who wears armloads of bracelets and 27 necklaces at once, and her motto is more is more and less is a bore. So I've always had a lot of fun in the children's book field, but UFOs. The book actually evolved during the pandemic. Ralph and I were both home, and he was in one room doing podcasts promoting his book on John Mack, the Harvard psychiatrist who had numerous patients who had abduction experiences. And I heard him being asked the same questions over and over again and answering them, and I frankly felt I was so familiar with the material at that time that I could have sat in for him answering questions. And I began to think about a book on UFOs, because as a children's book writer, for me, the hardest part of it is finding the right idea, finding a topic or a person who I really want to spend months with. And I began to think about the UFO field. So I did a little research and realized that there really was nothing out there for picture book readers. There are books for middle grade readers, children 10 to 15, and certainly numerous books for adults on UFOs, but nothing serious for children, and nothing that didn't spin the field with silliness and goofiness and dismissal. So I broached the subject with Ralph, and his reaction, of course, was radio silence. No response, the white noise of the wife. So, guilty as charged. So I brought up the book again, and I guess he was kind of mulling it over. And we began to talk about, what would we say and what would we include. And remember that in a children's book, you're basically dealing with 1,000 words. At most, ideally 800 words, and even better, 600 words. So when you think about the amount of information to convey in this field, that's a rather daunting task. So it kind of took us a while, and I think I sat down and wrote the first draft of the book. And, it shot back and forth between computers. And we were talking about this last night, and interestingly enough, we thought we had never collaborated before, and we forgot that, decades ago, we had collaborated on an article for the living section of the New York Times, if you remember the living section. And I was thinking about that, thinking to myself, as opposed to what? What do you put in the living section? Everything but obituaries. Well, that's where the article appeared. There was no dining section in those days. So we wrote an article about surviving vegetarianism for a week, because my background is nutrition. And I think one night I was sitting home eating oatmeal for dinner, and Ralph was having a hamburger. And I said, you meat every night? How about trying to go the healthy route? And can I prepare dinners that will appeal to you? And can you survive for an entire week eating vegetarian dinners? So in fact, here's the proof that he did survive. And and the article ran, and that was really the only time we ever collaborated on a project. For the most part, Ralph writes long and I write short. I tease him and say he never met a fact that he didn't like. And I, on the other hand, have the attention span of a gnat. So I stick to children's books, 32 pages, sometimes 40 pages. And so we've never collaborated before, but we thought this was a worthy project. And I don't even know how much time we spent, maybe 6 months working on the book and refining it. And what we really wanted to do was to turn out a book that was a primer for parents and for children and for people who are outside the field who just need a basic frame of reference. A book to bring people together to talk about UFOs. And we don't get into aliens, we don't get into who pilots the crafts. We just really wanted to provide kids with the building blocks of what is known and what is proven and what is absolute nonfiction in the field. And I think, as many of you know, smoke and mirrors are a big part of this field. And it's often very hard to sift out what's legitimate and what's not. So that was our intention with the book. And we also thought it was very key to have something to get rid of the stigma that many people who've had experiences with UFOs, seeing them, abduction experiences, things that people suffer from, the discomfort, the estrangement, the awkwardness, the aloneness. So we really hope that when we read this book to children, and we'll be doing a reading at Water Street Books at 2 o'clock, a free event, talking to kids, that we'll make them more comfortable, make parents more comfortable, and provide a tool for anyone in the field who wants to start the discussion. And I want to tell you a little bit about Adam Gustafson, who did the illustrations for the book. Adam signed on very willingly to do this book. He was very game, and he's a marvelous illustrator. And as I told Peter this morning, his art for this book was recently accepted into the Society of Illustrators original art show of children's book illustration. So that was quite an honor for him. He works very hard, and he also turns out pictures very quickly, which was great for us, because I don't know if some of you are aware that children's books can take as long as 4 years to be printed. The good illustrators are as busy as opera singers. You know, their dance cards are filled up for years ahead. So we were very lucky to get him, and we were very pleased that he could do the paintings so quickly. He worked very hard at getting the colors of the book right. If you could just advance the... He worked very hard at getting that strange bluish-green, eerie color. And I was thinking last night that I should talk to the Crayola people and suggest a new color, UFO green, to sort of capture that strange, muddy, odd, almost army green color. And that was very important to him. Detail is very important to him. He told me that we had done a book together several years back that just came out in paperback called The Blue House Dog, about a lost dog who eventually finds a happy home with a young boy who also lost his dog. And he told me that when he was illustrating the book, he got on his knees and he walked around his car to see the book from the perspective of a dog, how he would view the headlights of the car and the tail lights of the car. So I thought that was rather interesting. And in this book, there were also very interesting perspectives. He didn't see a UFO, and he didn't climb up on a ladder and get that view, but he has aerial views of UFOs. So I think it's kind of fascinating in terms of, you know, what he actually captured. So at this point, I think I'll turn the book over to the book. Turn the mic over to Ralph, and he can tell you a little bit about John Mack, who work inspired his entrance into the UFO field.
Great. Thank you, Deborah, and thank you all for being here. I was here last year, and I recognize some familiar faces. And it's kind of a homecoming for me, as Deb mentioned, because I teach summers at the Academy, and it seems like just yesterday we left when the session was over for the summer, and here we are back again. I love Exeter, and I love this opportunity. I was here last year talking about the believer. And when I'm here for the summer, I often take my bike along Route 150. I'm drawn there like the aliens were drawn to the power lines, because I want to identify and feel that vibe and try to recreate that vibe all these years later to see what that was all about. So this is a very atmospheric place for me. I want to talk for a minute about this picture that we put up. This is the first illustration in the book, and as Deb mentioned, the book is strictly nonfiction, and this little boy in the book is an illustration of somebody I talk about in The Believer, who was a colleague at Harvard with John Mack. His name is Wes Boyd. He's now a psychiatrist, and he told me that when he was a young boy in Florida, he and his friends saw a UFO on the tennis court. And so when he attended lectures by John Mack, he immediately could identify with it, knew that John Mack was telling the truth about these experiences. So we rendered Wes Boyd as a boy at the tennis court. So anyway, and I think Adam did a wonderful job. So later we'll talk a little more about what it's like to collaborate with your spouse on a book. Not a common experience, and a very happy one in our case. It's an interesting experience. So how I got into the UFO business. In 2004, I was a New York Times correspondent in Texas, and I picked up a paperback in a used bookstore by John Mack called Passport to the Cosmos. It was his second book. He was a Harvard psychiatrist who, through contacts with Bud Hopkins, Peter's good friend, a pioneer of the alien abduction field, John Mack got interested in the whole question of these stories that people were telling him that seemed completely outlandish and impossible. And he started convening his own group of experiencers, which he called them, a better word than abductees, because nobody knows what the experience really involves. And he did his own research, and he got into trouble at Harvard, which I talk about in my book, The Believer. Harvard put him under investigation. I call it the Inquisition. And he emerged not unscathed, because it cost him millions of dollars in legal fees, but he was cleared of any wrongdoing. And then, so to pick up the story, I had this book by John Mack. I'd never heard of him, didn't know who he was. I thought it's interesting that a Harvard psychiatrist is interested in aliens, and that could make a good story for the Times. So I thought I'd call him up at Harvard. This was 2004. And before I could do that, I pick up the New York Times one day and find out he's been run over in London, where he'd gone to talk about his Pulitzer Prize-winning biography of Lawrence of Arabia 30 years later. And he would look the wrong way down a London street, which Yanks are prone to do, and got run over by a guy who had had too much to drink. Immediately at the time, stories circulated that he was rubbed out, it was an assassination. I looked into that very carefully subsequently and got the police reports, and it truly was an accident. There was no, malevolence or planning beforehand. Anyway, so I was working on, so I called John Mack's family. They were deeply grieving, and they didn't want to talk to anybody. But eventually I made contact with them and said I wanted to do a book about John Mack because the story really resonated with me. And and they gave me access to all his archives, which were voluminous. He saved everything, family videos, his own therapy sessions, because every psychiatrist has to go through his own analysis, and very personal stuff about his life. And I was working on that it turned out, I didn't realize it at the time, it was going to take 17 years to put out that book, which came out first in 2021. In the course of doing the research for the book, I met Bud Hopkins, who got John Mack interested initially in the abduction phenomenon, and Bud Hopkins' good friend, Leslie Kane. Leslie, who's the dean of UFO reporters, I'm sure you know her name, we became good friends, and I was working on the John Mack book still in 2017 when she came to me one day and said she'd just been down to Washington and was at a high-level meeting of intelligence people and found out that the U.S. government does have a UFO program that was deeply secret, nobody knew about. It was called under different names, OSAP. Initially started in 2007, but at that time it was known as ATIP, the Advanced Aerospace Threat Identification Program, and was run by a guy named Luis Elizondo with impeccable intelligence credentials. And at this meeting, Leslie found out that Elizondo had just sent in his letter of resignation to Defense Secretary Jim Mattis because Elizondo was being thwarted by superiors in the Pentagon who thought the whole subject of UFOs was demonic, not something that anybody should study. It was something evil. So he had quit, but the story hadn't broken yet. The people he sent the letter up through the ranks to wouldn't even show it to Jim Mattis. They were afraid of his reaction. So we had this whole amazing story. I still had my contacts at the New York Times, although by then I had retired from the regular staff. I was freelancing for them in other papers. So I contacted editors and I said, we have a sensational story, all on the record, no anonymous sources. We had Lou Elizondo on the record. We had videos, actually, of some of the encounters between Navy pilots and UFOs, which have since become very famous. We had the whole story, and it didn't take much to convince the New York Times that this was a good story, in fact, and we teamed up with Helene Cooper, who was the Pentagon correspondent. And the story ran on the front page on a Sunday, December 17th, 2017. It was a bombshell, which I guess we kind of figured, but we didn't know how big a bombshell it would be. It's now being said that it, sort of changed the paradigm and made it safe for mainstream publications to report on UFOs, so we'll take that credit. And since then, Leslie and I collaborated on a number of other stories in the New York Times, including one on near misses between Navy pilots and UFOs. And the story that was the most difficult, really, to get was on supposed retrievals of crashed debris from crashed UFOs. We got that into the New York Times, very carefully hedged. We were able to report it because Eric Davis, a contractor, had briefed congressional staff on these crash retrievals with slides. That was the only way we could get that story in the New York Times, because you can't get it just by reporting anecdotally that somebody unnamed says the U.S. has, crash debris. So we got that story in the New York Times. So we continued, Leslie and I continued to report on this issue. And then just this year, Leslie came to me with another bombshell. She had found this intelligence agent, still active in the government, who was soon to retire, named David Grush, who was alleging with his high-level intelligence contacts that the U.S. had actual intact craft hidden away, and pieces of craft, but also intact craft, that it had kept this a deep secret from Congress, including the funding that ran these programs, which private defense contractors were in on the scheme to hide these things, and that there was a Cold War struggle between Russia and China and the U.S. to reverse engineer the technology from these craft. I mean, amazing stuff. And that he had been illegally retaliated against as a whistleblower, because in the Defense Authorization Act of 2022, which President Biden signed, there's a provision saying that anyone with information about UFOs can bring, and even if he or she signed non-disclosure agreements, deeply secret, whatever, if that information has been withheld from Congress, or that information deserves to be known by certain congressional committees, that person can bring that information forward without any penalty. It's the whistleblower statute. So he abided by that, David Grush, and of course he was retaliated against. He lost his clearance. He suffered terrible threats, which we did not detail in detail, but personal threats of bodily harm. And of course we had David Grush on the record, and we broke that story shortly before he became a witness in the most recent congressional hearings with Ryan Graves and Dave Fravor, two pilots. Anyway, so we broke that story, and I should say that David Grush had another aspect to his credibility. He was represented by the first Inspector General of the intelligence community, a lawyer named Chuck McCullough. So Grush was eminently believable. We wouldn't have featured him in the Times if he wasn't. I mean, I've taken the story sort of to the present, which is where Leslie and I are continuing to gather information to report on things. There are other whistleblowers who have not become public, who are waiting in the wings to come forward. It's still very shrouded in secrecy, but hopefully that information will come forward shortly. So to get back to our children's book, why don't I let Deb talk a little bit about this collaboration which she touched on, and then we'll take it forward.
We're often asked, what's it like to write a book with your spouse? And I have to say, because it was a children's book, it was a pretty painless exercise. We've, over the years, read each other's work before, when certainly I didn't read Ralph's newspaper articles because he wrote most of them on deadline and, 5 hours at the paper. But whenever he wrote longer magazine articles or his books, I would always be the first set of eyes to see them. And when I wrote my children's books and magazine articles for the New York Times, I would always take advantage of his expertise and say, could you just eyeball this, see if anything jumps out at you? And so we have been doing this back and forth for the length of our careers. So it really is nice to have an in-house editor to look over your work before you release it to the world or to an agent or anyone else. So that part was kind of fun. In terms of writing children's books, I was also thinking about this last night, that the set of skills required to be a journalist and the set of skills to be a children's book writer are really the same, because what you're doing is taking a complex field of information and whittling it down and telling a story in the most simple, elemental way. And that's what both of us do. I mean, when you write a newspaper article, you have to get everything into the nut graph, because if you don't catch the reader in the first graph or two, they're gone. They're not going to read the rest. And the same goes for writing a children's book. Unless you're able to take a massive amount of material and make it readable and fun and interesting for kids, they're going to toss it and pick up another book. So we really do have the same skills, so I think that made it a lot easier. And then there was, what do we do? Shoot the book back and forth between computers, basically, and discuss wording. In our first version of the book, we didn't include Wes and his friend Ken, and then it occurred to me, well, it's a children's book. You have to put, if possible, you put a child into the book that a child can relate to. So we decided to introduce the two characters to start the book. And then really the hardest part for me has always been doing an author's note. An author's note is a section after you tell the story that gives more information. It's something librarians always like, and gives parents more information. But for me as a children's book writer, it's always harder to write, because I'm thinking, well, who's reading this? Is the child reading it? Is it the parent reading it? Is it the teacher reading it? And of course the answer is all three, and you have to appeal to everyone. Originally, when we wrote the book, the author's note was far too academic, and then we scrapped it and we talked to our editor about whether we even needed an author's note, and we decided yes, we did. So we went back and rewrote it. And
before we get to that, the author's note was the triumph at the end. Talk a little bit about the struggle we had to get it published.
Well, that was another key thing, because who's going to publish a book about UFOs? And I think editorially you have the same reaction you do in the general public. Half the people are fascinated and half are like, I don't want to know about that. Oh, you believe in that stuff? And, you know, we got some of that too, and some of the editors liked the idea but thought, no, it's a middle grade book, it's not a picture book. But we thought it definitely is a picture book because people are having these experiences all over the world, children, adults, and what do you do when you have an experience like that? For the most part, you come home and you tell your family. And children are very smart, whether you're explaining things to them or not, they're picking up information. You know, they have antenna ears, and they hear things, and they put them together. And they may not ask their questions right then and there, but, you know, you'll be in the middle of the supermarket picking out carrots, and your child will ask you a question out of nowhere because it's been on his mind or her mind. So we had to find the right publisher for the book, and we ended up with the University of New Mexico Press because we knew they would be interested in publishing a credible, well-researched book. And they were very careful, they were very slow getting back to us, and they actually had an unusual process where they accepted the manuscript, they hired the illustrator, they had all the paintings done, and then at that point they had to show the book to their board, which that's never been my experience, that after an illustrator does his work, it then has to be approved. Fortunately, the board approved it, but there was an extra layer that they did send the book out to child psychiatrists and psychologists to get their feedback, to see if they thought it was appropriate for children, if we raised issues that would make them uncomfortable or that perhaps weren't appropriate. And so the book was screened very carefully, which of course gave us an extra level of comfort publishing it.
And anxiety.
And anxiety, because that's always there. But I mean, I think we were pretty confident at that point. We had done a book of only verifiable information, really very, very elementary, a book to foster discussion, interaction, and comfort about the field, and again, to reduce stigma and any ill feelings or discomfort that anybody who has experienced either seeing a UFO or had an abduction experience might feel and might have kept inside them. So that really, am I leaving anything out?
I want to talk about John and children.
Yeah.
So, you know, Deborah's background really was in writing children's books, and mine was writing adult books and writing for the New York Times. But working on the John Mack biography really gave me a good insight into the world of children and UFOs, because John Mack, as a psychiatrist with 3 boys of his own, was very interested in how this phenomenon impacted children. So he found, for example, in one case that there was a 2-year-old kid who was the son of an abductee or an experiencer who had in his own childish way an experience. He said, he told John, little man come, little man fly me into the sky. This kid could barely speak. He'd never seen movies. He'd never read books on UFOs, but he somehow had some experience that he related to John Mack, that he felt he had been abducted and taken up into a ship. So John Mack was very taken with these children's accounts because he thought that, I mean, he was a psychiatrist. He specialized in figuring out when people were lying to him or fabricating or making things up. And these kids, he felt, were not. And the kids, and especially the adults, were recreating their traumas when they were telling him about their experiences. So that's one of the things that made him believe that these stories were authentic. Anyway, he was very interested in the kids' stories, and at one point, you may know the story of the landing in at the school in Harare, Zimbabwe, in 1990. Ariel School in 1995. There's a very good documentary by Randy Nickerson now, actually screening in Boston this weekend, I believe. But anyway, 60 kids were at recess, mixed race, mixed age kids were at recess at the school in Zimbabwe when a craft landed, by their accounts, and two beings got out. The kids had telepathic communications with these beings. They later drew pictures of the craft and the beings that they remembered. The pictures were very similar. The kids were not looking at each other's papers and making it up as they went along. It certainly became clear to John Mack and the teachers at the school. So we incorporated that story into our book because it's a children's book and we wanted children to relate, and these were children who were reporting these experiences, and we have some of the drawings in the book.
But we left out the alien beings.
We left out the aliens because, again, we wanted this to be fact-based, and that's a dimension that
We didn't go into.
will require an additional level of authentication. So, I mean, it's very complicated to explain that. Anyway, you want to talk about the hopes for the book, or?
Well, yeah, I guess I think we'll end with the fact that we hope what we've accomplished with this book is just a very non-judgmental book that, again, eliminates stigma and that provokes discussion. And I just want to end by reading you the short author's note and to get a sense of how we did this. Why write a picture book about something we don't understand? Why puzzle over unidentified flying objects, a mystery to today's scientists, pilots, generals, journalists, teachers, librarians, and our earliest ancestors from the time of the caveman? Because human beings are curious, we are born to wonder. So when ancient people saw things in the sky that they couldn't understand, they made notes, or rather scratched images into rocks and wrote down stories. Today, we continue to explore our home planet and beyond, distant galaxies that take us back like time machines to the dawn of creation. Astronauts orbit the Earth to step foot on the moon again, and perhaps other worlds, but UFOs remain a mystery. We do keep learning more, and now we know that our government has been studying them too. On the front page of the New York Times in December of 2017, Ralph and other reporters told how Navy pilots and their instruments captured images and electronic footprints of so-called unidentified aerial phenomena, UAPs. And an official report in 2021 said most probably do represent physical objects. So the government confirmed they are real. More than that, no one really knows yet. So why did we write a book with more questions than answers? To get us thinking, not only about the mystery of UFOs, but also how much there is yet to discover about the entire cosmos. And yes, Wes and Ken are real people.
Thank you.
Thank you. We'll take some questions.
We'll take away one more reminder. We'll be across the street at 2 o'clock at Water Street Books, signing books and talking to kids, especially kids, but...
a free event.
Free event.
Okay.
Question?
Yep.
Go ahead.
Are sightings and crashes as frequent in all countries as in the USA? And how do those other countries keep them secret as the USA does?
Want me to take that?
Yeah.
Yes, they are as frequent in many countries around the world as in the U.S. It's a common misconception that this is only happening in America. We have the most pervasive communications network, so these things get reported here, but they're reported in Australia, they're reported in Asia, they're reported certainly in Latin America, and I don't think they're kept secret. I think they probably surface in publications. There's less of a stigma in many of those countries than there is here, so papers and governments talk about it more freely than here. But because we have the big, communications companies, they tend to get more publicity here. Thank you.
Yes?
Dave Fravor?
We could use you up here.
We could use you up here. Let me just say this quickly because there may be some other people with questions. The 3 videos that we put out in the New York Times are only pieces of much longer videos that the government has locked in its vaults. We do not know the full extent of these videos that they've collected over the years. That's one of the many secrets the government is keeping, perhaps according to many witnesses, improperly, because it doesn't reveal any secrets of reverse engineering to say that we have images that go far beyond anything that's come out already. The government possesses these. We haven't seen them because they're classified. So there are many in full color and black and white, all kinds of images, full videos, long videos that we haven't seen that the public, in my view, has a right to see. Other questions? Yeah.
I was just curious, I don't know how long you're looking to get out, but what is the kids' perception of what kind of feedback?
So far, we've only heard good things. I mean, maybe if we have, that's all they tell you. But no, kids have been very positive about it. And
April 15th,
yeah, it came out April 15th. We've heard cases, oh, my little boy wants us to read it again and again, so we're thrilled to hear that.
You know, you just reminded me of one thing. We did a signing recently in, I forgot where it was. There have been so many. Well, we did one in Portsmouth, in well, anyway, somebody came up to us, and people have all these stories. So when you are at a signing and people come up and they volunteer story, oh, I saw this, I had this sighting. So there are many stories that probably never find their way to MUFON. But people, just like Valerie said this one, she didn't tell anybody about this sighting. So, but we don't know, really. We're hoping that, word gets around, more people will buy it, but authors are the last to know how a book is doing. Yeah.
We thought about taking that book and making a digital version and then having someone take each picture and add color to it, not color, but
Comments?
lighting, correct, to make it move.
Oh,
Actual lighting.
animate.
It's a good idea.
There's a way to, I've seen that before, you can make this spectacular.
Come alive.
Kids love the lights, like the motion, it's not changing your picture, but it's highlighting things with lighting.
That is a good idea. There is a Kindle version, but obviously you're suggesting something beyond that, which is, it's an exciting idea.
Over here.
Regards to your story, the debrief recently, I'm comparing I'm trying to figure out why the Times is so, they embraced the story of 2017 in comparison to the story about David Rush and put the debrief.
Yeah, we get asked that question a lot. Why did we publish that story in the debrief? We took it to the New York Times in an early version. As soon as we heard about David Grush, as soon as Leslie came to me, I went to the Times. We didn't have the whole story yet, so perhaps it was too unformed for them to make a decision. They passed on it. They passed. Then we went to the Washington Post, and they were very interested, and we were talking to them for more than a month, but they have very involved procedures to vet a story, as you would imagine, and it was taking a long time, too long in our view, and then David Grush's name leaked out on the internet, and he was in danger, because the one thing that would protect him is to identify him as the source of the story, a figure, and that gives people a measure of protection. Once their name is out, it's kind of counterintuitive, but the truth is people are safer if they're known than if it's just some kind of a whisper on the internet. Anyway, his name surfaced, and he was getting terrible threats, and the way to protect him was to get the story out quickly. And the debrief was a way to do that. They were a very intelligent website catering to the defense and intelligence establishments. They had their own very strict vetting. They have a lot of experts there, so it didn't just pop into the debrief. It was carefully checked, and we went through a lot of editorial back and forth on that. But that's how it came out in the debrief instead of the Washington Post or the New York Times. Sometimes you just have to go where the editorial interest is. I think we probably have to wrap up soon, but any other...
How are we doing on time, Peter?
Yeah? Oh, you got time for more questions if there are any.
Yes?
Yes, in your presentation, you mentioned David Grush experienced terrible threats. Are you at liberty to discuss what those threats were, specifically who gave you those threats?
I don't want to say too much about that because he hasn't, but there was a very revealing moment at his congressional testimony. It jumped out at me, and maybe some of you remember it. He was asked in this public session, he said that people have actually been killed. Witnesses have been killed in the course of these UFO investigations. And the question to him was, well, were they killed by government agents or aliens? And he said, both. Whoa. And then that passed. And then he said he couldn't discuss it more in public session, but he did say he was willing to go into much more detail behind closed doors in private session, which seems to me he threw down the gauntlet to Congress to say, I can give you the names of people who are first-hand witnesses. He was not a first-hand witness. He said that from the beginning. He said he only knew these stories about recovery of craft from his contacts in the intelligence field, good contacts, to be sure, but he didn't put his hands on a craft. He made that clear. But he knew people who had. So he said, I will give you the names, and I will tell you, he told Congress, where these craft are being stored. I mean, that's sensational. So that didn't come out in the public session. But Congress has been on recess now for the summer, so as far as I know, they have not taken him up on his offer yet. But if they do, but as Peter told us, Tim Burchett, the congressman from Kentucky, who's been a leader in this UFO field, very outspoken and vocal, he wants to have more hearings, and he wants to, so he's pushing, and a lot of powerful people in Congress. You know, this is what I say to people who say that the government has been hiding this stuff, and it's been under a stigma since World War II. It's all true, but we've made tremendous progress. I mean, Congress was long afraid to tackle this subject because no person running for office wanted his or her opponent to say this person's crazy, believes in UFOs. So Congress was always very reluctant to tackle the subject. Well, now they're tackling it, and now there are reports. There's a deadline for different organizations, Arrow and its previous incarnations, UAP Task Force, to report to the public and report to Congress, plans for closed-door hearings. So I think this train is moving. And to mix an image, you can't put this genie back in the bottle. It's too late. So I think it's a very encouraging time. Only more information can surface. We can't go back to a time when the government shuts down Blue Book and says, there's nothing to see here, folks. So I think, especially with everybody like you pushing for more disclosure and more information, it's going to be impossible for the government to keep hiding what it knows, what's clear, that there's stuff up there that we don't know about, there's stuff going in the water. Bob McGuire, one UFO expert, told me not long ago he was on a submarine, a Navy submarine, and something blew past them underwater at the speed of sound. And he said it was physically impossible, according to our understanding of physics, for anything with the resistance of water to attain that speed of 700 miles an hour underwater. But he said he saw it. Anyway, there's a lot yet to come out. There was another question. Yeah.
What are your thoughts, or what do you think is the reason for sudden momentum in the disclosure movement? Like, for 80 years it was all keeping it secret, but all of a sudden now we're seeing a lot of movement. Is there some evidence?
Okay. The subtext of your question is it a conspiracy to leak this stuff out now in a certain way? And was your New York Times story leaked to you for any purpose? That's what I understand is the basis of your question. So I can tell you that no, it was not leaked to us in any way that we could determine. We ferreted out that information. Leslie has and had very, very good sources who shared this information with her. We have a lot of other information which we've been collecting, which we can't report yet because it's not, verified yet. But and it's not because people want to leak something to us at a particular time for certain outcome. It's because there's a lot of good reporting that goes into that and contacts. So I think there's just something about the time and the place that come together at certain times and that make it more possible. And I think the technology that we have today and, a lot of other complicated things of the zeitgeist make this a time when this information is more likely to come out than in previous. And during the height of the Cold War, certainly there was great paranoia in the government about letting our enemies know anything about, what we were finding. But they were finding the same things. So they were paranoid too. But there was no sharing of information. And there still isn't. So to answer your question, I don't think there's anything nefarious that happened a few years ago that explains why it's coming out now. I think it's complicated. It's the march of time, different people working on it, the Stanton Friedmans, the Kathleen Martins, the people who have done the groundbreaking work on which all this is based, I think are our heroes, and that's the reason why we're where we are today. Yeah.
I think you go, teacher friend of mine gave me a copy for years ago, what reminds me what we do in children's books. I believe this came from Arizona. She was a teacher, gave me about Bob Herman, how did we learn that? And it's simply that
I like that idea. I just stole it from you. Thank you.
Yeah. Yeah.
Just a reflection, I'm a retired teacher, and I think, at first when I heard about your writing this book, I thought, what a frightening thing for children to be exposed to this mystery that no one can answer, we don't know about, and then having heard about it more, this is a great thing, not only for children who may experience lots of different kinds of traumatic events that they don't understand, but for adults too, to be such a great vehicle in a simple way, in simple language, for everybody to talk about it. There's adults who can't talk about it. This kind of trauma, and lots of other kind of trauma.
Well, I think you raise a very good point. To me, what's most frightening is not talking about a subject and then, having all your fears and anxieties take over. So yes, that's what we hope to accomplish in this book. And I think that the most traumatized kids are the ones who were not exposed to things that happen in life. I didn't hear about death in my family till my grandfather died when I was away at sleepaway camp. And of course, I wasn't told about it till I got home. I was 12 years old. I mean, come on. My parents were trying to spare me, but I think they made a huge mistake. We need to talk about these things. And fortunately, the children's book field is becoming much more sophisticated. So there are topics about things that maybe years ago they would never have looked at. Dealing with a parent who has cancer, transgender issues, all of that there are books now. And that's what we need. We need tools, we need research materials for the libraries, and so we're heading in the right direction.
But at the same time, there's a backlash, as you know, in libraries. There are people who say this book is inappropriate, this can't be shown to children. So there's a battle going on. But we hope that this is a subject that is presented in a neutral enough way, a fact-based way, that everybody can identify with it. And as Deb said, that parents themselves can feel more comfortable with discussing with their kids.
And just a last word about book banning. I think if the people who want to ban books only realize what they're doing is magnifying interest in the books they want to ban. All the bookstores have tables of banned books, If you want to ban a book, just shut up and don't talk about it. Chances are it'll die a natural death. So leave it alone.
How are we doing, Peter? Okay, anybody else?
Last question?
Everybody's eager to have lunch and eat, so why don't we call an end, and thank you all for your attention. Appreciate it.
Okay.
Thank you, Ralph and Deborah. Next speaker is at 2. Do not use this clock as your point of reference. And also at 2 o'clock at Water Street Books, right across the street, Deborah and Ralph will be doing a book signing on UFOs. So you have special children in your life? Christmas, birthdays, Hanukkah, you name it. Weddings if they're married young. Have a great lunch.